You're watching Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. First, though, our top stories here tonight. And China's president has warned the deadly coronavirus is spreading quickly as the country confirms more than 1,300 cases and 42 deaths. A member of the panel for the Grenfell Tower inquiry has resigned after she was linked to the firm which supplied the cladding on the tower block. And lawyers for President Trump have told his Senate impeachment trial that efforts to remove him from office would set a dangerous precedent during an election year. Hello there, you're watching the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and the Guido Fawkes reporter Tom Harwood. So, very good evening to you two.
Hello.
So let's take a look at what's making those Sunday paper front pages. And the Mail on Sunday is suggesting that plans are being drawn up to airlift British citizens out of Wuhan in China, which has been the epicentre of the coronavirus outbreak. The Observer reports that ministers have been told that it would cost at least £12 billion to scrap the HS2 high-speed rail link. That story is also the lead in the Sunday Telegraph, which reports on allegations of multiple cover-ups relating to the soaring costs of the scheme. The Sunday Express says Boris Johnson hopes the UK will become a global trailblazer after leaving the EU. The Sunday Times reports the Prime Minister is on course for a diplomatic war with Donald Trump over plans to hand Huawei's access to Britain's 5G network. The Sunday Mirror carries the story of a man who says he was drugged by serial rapist Reynard Sinaga and that a violent struggle ensued between them. The Daily Star reports on a star of EastEnders being suspended from the show. And The Sun says model Lauren Goodman has revealed that she's expecting a baby and claims that an unnamed England footballer is the father. So, Rachel Shabi and Tom Harwood here with me tonight. And we're going to kick off with the story that has led many newspapers and bulletins as well, and that is the coronavirus. The Observer's front page story is about HS2, which we're going to come to in a moment, but you wanted to focus on the picture story in the second headline. China puts 50 million in quarantine, and it is an extraordinary step, isn't it, from a country trying to come to terms and deal with this epidemic.
It's so easy to look at a number of like 50 million and not really contextualise it. I mean, you almost think of that Stalin quote that, you know, 1 million deaths is a statistic, but one is a tragedy. But that's 50 million people who have had their liberty removed from them. That's almost the population of England there in one fell swoop, really affected by this. And it shows the scale that I'm not sure everyone was fully across until the last few days. This is a really, really serious issue.
Well, it is, and there's still a lot of questions to be answered about it, aren't there, which scientists are trying to get to the bottom of, trying to establish where it's come from, to what extent it is transferring human to human, which it clearly is, but how much of a problem, the potential death rate, and, of course, scrabbling to try and come up with a vaccine to try and solve it. But in the meantime, very interesting steps being taken by China to try to contain it.
Yeah, it must be such an extraordinary operation, just because, as Tom says, the incredible scale of it, 50 million people having to be put in quarantine, just logistically, operationally, how you would do that is immense. It's an immense operation. And so, you know, China is trying, as we say, to do all it can to, you know, impose this lockdown, even while some people, you know, people do want to celebrate the Lunar New Year within the confines of that lockdown. But we are hearing all kinds of reports of, you know, hospitals absolutely at capacity. There are plans to build 1,000-bed hospital in 10 days to meet some of the capacity
as well now,
right.
Going up within a week or something.
And there was
staggering.
A big PR effort on the behalf of the Chinese government, where they sort of sent out these videos of dozens and dozens of diggers constructing these hospitals, and it looked like this was a country that could be on top of it. But actually, the scale now reaching 50 million, 1 or 2 hospitals, is not going to come anywhere close to being able to deal with it.
Well, that's right. They're now talking about a second emergency hospital, that they hope will handle 1,300 cases. And actually, there was a similar situation with the SARS outbreak back in 2003, and apparently they built a hospital in 7 days, largely out of prefabricated buildings, which is why they were able to put it up at some speed. These are the pictures I think you're referring to, Tom, of all those diggers there ready to get to work. I mean, extraordinary scenes, and ones you can't imagine in another country in some ways. The fact that the way that China is run means that putting in some of these cancelling bus services, effectively shutting towns, it's hard to imagine happening elsewhere.
Well, I suppose, you know, when you're in a country that large, then you have capacity to do things at that scale, right? I mean, you would just have capacity to scale up. But even then, just the level of coordination and operation that you would need for this, and also, of course, just to manage the level of anxiety that people would have and try to prevent any kind of panic causing any sort of surge in any context, you know. So keeping a handle of that. And we're hearing people, Chinese people who are being interviewed are saying that they absolutely do have trust in official announcements about the virus and what's happening operationally. And you would need that. You absolutely would need that sort of public buy-in to what the government is saying in order to execute this kind of operation, right?
And President Xi has been talking today, actually. He talked about the virus accelerating and he talked about it being a grave situation.
Yeah.
But let's turn to the Mail on Sunday, shall we? Because they turn attention to Britain. They say airlift to save Britain's trapped by virus. And they're talking about a possible evacuation plan of some who are near the epicentre, if you like, of this virus.
And this is a bit of a U-turn. For the last few days, they were saying that they were not going to bring people out of the area. But after, I think it was France and the US said that they were going to extract their citizens, now the UK is belatedly rowing in and looking at ways to get people out of there and obviously move them back to a quarantine situation in this country. But more than that, there are 2,000 people in this country who the government's trying to track down, locate and test for this virus. There have
people
been
who've travelled recently.
People who have
Wuhan,
recently returned from the area, a lot of them students. There have been no confirmed cases yet in this country of coronavirus, but there have just been 3 in France. And what this piece says is they expect that within days there will be 1 confirmed in this country.
That's right. This is a double-page spread inside the Mail on Sunday, isn't it? This is pages 10 and 11. I don't know if we can look at those now. There we go. And at the same time, we should remember that Public Health England talked yesterday about the risk being low. They also talked about lots of measures in place to be ready for this. And it's easy for people to worry about it, understandably, but at the same time, we do still have those questions about just how infectious it is or just how dangerous it is at the moment.
That's right. But the grey area seems to be the incubation period, doesn't it? So if it takes a week before you show symptoms of it, then there's that sort of perilous area of a week in which, you know, you might be carrying it unwittingly. So that's the bit that, you know, they need to get a handle on. But there is a race now to find a virus, and, you know, the international community of scientists are all, you know, working full speed to develop a virus and are expected to be doing so imminently. Public Health England itself made a breakthrough, developed a genetic test capable of diagnosing within a day. Obviously, that is a crucial breakthrough, given that if you are a carrier, then you need to be quarantined immediately. So the sooner that is detected, obviously, the better for everybody. So that is quite a significant breakthrough.
Yeah, certainly, and British scientists are being really bigged up by this piece in the Mail, where more are going to be flying out to the area to work with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations and help deliver that cure, that vaccine. But yeah, ultimately, this is something that is, I think, has been underestimated in terms of the scale, and perhaps we are right to be a little bit more cautious about the whole affair.
Yeah, and hopefully some lessons have been learned from SARS and MERS, which is another form of coronavirus, I believe.
Yeah.
Let's move on to another story, though, which is getting a couple of headlines in the papers, and this is concerning HS2. The Observer there saying the £12 billion bill for scrapping the high-speed rail link, and we're expecting a decision imminently, aren't we, on whether all of it or some of it will go ahead.
I find this story a little bit funny in The Observer because ultimately they're saying this £12 billion bill is being made up of the £9 billion that has already been spent and potentially £3 about winding it down. That's nothing in comparison to the cost of it going forward, which is well over £100 billion. So it's sort of odd that they're trying to spin this as a cost-saving measure to then spend a further £90 billion building the thing. But it does show that this is a real debate within government. You'd think that a Conservative stonking majority would not have these sort of disagreements, and yet this is something that there are very passionate views on both sides amongst Conservative MPs. There are lots of Conservative MPs with constituencies that are being deeply affected by HS2. Naturally, you'd expect them to be more against the project, but there's also an ideological underpinning to this argument, whereby the sort of more free market right side of the party is very, very sceptical of this project, and they see it as a sort of white elephant, spending for spending's sake. And the cost is something that we're going to be hearing repeatedly. It's interesting that the pro-HS2 side are trying to win that argument and present arguments in terms of cost that has been something that the anti-HS2 side has seen as a card that they should play. And we
only have a very little time before we ought to go to a break, but I'm going to show the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. I'm not sure if we've got time to do it justice here, but they have more suggestions of inflated costs and allegations against HS2 Limited, the company behind it, which they're denying. But it feeds into this controversy over the cost and perhaps, would you say, a divided country as well as perhaps divided politicians over it?
Well, I think we will have to go into this in more detail maybe after the break, but these are allegations coming from the former Director of Strategy and others at HS2, which is accused of inflating the cost, but also covering that up, which, as you say, the government has denied those allegations. But it's an interesting division, isn't it? But I think it speaks to the division inside the Conservative Party itself, because it is now comprised of, both in terms of voters and government, it's comprised of this weird, uneasy alliance of people who do believe in state intervention and people who are fiscally free marketeers. So I'm not really sure how that's going to play out going forward.
I'm going to have to cut you off, only because we really do need to go to a break, but we'll have plenty of time to revisit these issues next hour, if not after the break. But we are going to go to that break. Coming up, our guests will ponder various subjects, including why the Sunday Express thinks it's still front-page news that Boris Johnson believes that Brexit is going to be great. We'll have more on that in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, Rachel, Shabi and Tom Harwood. And we're going to turn to the front page of the Sunday Express. And they are leading with Boris and Brexit, they say.
They are, and surprise, surprise, Boris thinks that Brexit will be brilliant, and so does the Sunday Express. I don't think that these are this is massive news, but what it does tie into is sort of that future plan of this government. This is a piece that mentions the potential US trade agreement that the American Treasury Secretary has been saying should be done concurrently in the next 11 months with the EU deal. The Americans are quite keen to have a deal done before their election in November, and that sort of deadline could be quite conducive to getting a good deal on the UK side. But more than that, this is Boris saying that he wants Britain, in the week that we're leading up to finally leaving the European Union, he wants Britain to become a global trailblazer, setting its own standards and being able to innovate in a way that the rest of the world will follow.
What do you make of it, Rachel?
I mean, these are lovely words from Boris Johnson, but, you know, it all remains to be seen, doesn't it? The thing about the deadlines for trade negotiations is that it is not enough time, clearly. There's very little that can be done by this sort of self-imposed cut-off period of the end of 2020. Talk about tying your own hands in a negotiation. Why you would impose that deadline on yourself, I really don't know. But what's clear is that the scale of things that need to be done, it's very unlikely that we'll have anything other than a very sort of bare bones, skeletal agreements with the EU, never mind any other countries, perhaps very short-term ones that need to renew year on year, perhaps, you know, with fisheries, for instance, maybe something like Norway, which renegotiates on a yearly basis. But it's going to be very basic, whatever it is.
Very briefly, do you accept that? I mean, the time pressure is going to be the problem. Even there's the political will, but it's going to be in everyone's interest.
Deadlines do make deals. If this was a more open-ended thing, there wouldn't be that pressure, and the pressure does yield results. And ultimately, we're already starting to see the results. Just yesterday, the government said it was opting out of the EU's copyright directive. That's one of the examples of things of this country doing things differently and better in a way that's going to innovate and make things better for the future.
OK, we're going to move on. Next Friday is the deadline for Britain leaving the EU. It's also the end of Veganuary for a lot of people. This is my rather tortuous link into the next story.
It worked.
I've now left you only with about 20 seconds to talk about it. But it's suggesting that some of these products are perhaps not as healthy as...
No, well, there's...
Imagine, is that what they're saying?
Some of them, you risk consuming more salt and sugar than if you ate the real thing, according to this expose on plant foods. And in particular, it's zoned in on egg yolks, which I don't know how they're made when they're vegan, but they are 40 times saltier than actual egg yolks.
OK.
It is a great irony. The kind of people that tell us all to be vegans are somewhat sort of more health-aware, more smug, some might say, and having a story like this does turn the tables somewhat in a satisfying way.
OK, brace yourself. Your Twitter's going to be full of
You've
comments.
brought that on yourself, Tom.
Anyway, we are out of time, but I'll see you both again at 11:30. Thank you.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, after a spell of largely set...
Make of it? What do you make of the group? What
We were going to definitely...
What's Boris's...
Million people 20% more active by 2025.
Coming up next, we've got the press preview for you, taking you through the Sunday papers. This is what's on the front of tomorrow's Sunday Times. Angry Trump casts cloud on Boris's big day. One of the stories that we're going to be discussing in a moment with the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and the Guido Fawkes reporter Tom Harwood. That's coming up next. So Rachel Shabi and Tom Harwood here with me tonight. A number of stories in the papers tomorrow that you want to talk about, but we're going to kick off with the coronavirus, which has obviously led a lot of TV bulletins, but also newspaper front pages. It's featuring on the front of The Observer tomorrow morning as their second story. China puts 50 million in quarantine, and China, the epicentre of this virus, the vast majority of cases still in that country, and China taking some pretty drastic measures to try to contain it. Incredibly drastic measures. I mean, in this country, imagining quarantining 50 million people, it's totally unimaginable. This is a pandemic, epidemic operation on a scale that I'm not sure has been tried before in such a busy and bustling country as China. It's surprising to see entire cities in lockdown and people not being able to move. A deeply worrying thing for 50 million people to be under that pressure, and of course 1,300 cases already confirmed, some as close as France to this country. So this is something that is deeply concerning. It's right that it's taking up quite a lot of the news agenda this weekend. Well, that's right, and the President of China has spoken about it as well today, hasn't he? And he's talked about the spread of the new virus accelerating. He's talked about the country facing a grave situation. And it's not just the shutting off of towns and cities, stopping the transport, to stop people moving around and potentially spreading it. It's also the building of hospitals in record time as well to try to treat it. Yeah, that's right, because obviously the hospitals can't cope with the scale of this. It's just mind-boggling scale of an operation that's going on in China right now. And we understand that now 2 new hospitals are going to be built. Last week, there was an announcement that 1 hospital with capacity to treat 1,000 people was going to be built in 10 days. And now we hear that another one is slated for that as well. But
the scale of that operation, to be able to put that volume of people under lockdown, and the level of coordination that requires, and also the level of trust it requires, because you couldn't do that unless there was a buy-in to official pronouncements on what was going on keeping people informed and people believing that they were kept informed of the situation. Otherwise, you might have all kinds of chaos happening with people panicking or worrying. I mean, obviously, it's a hugely worrying situation. It would be incredibly anxiety-inducing to be in that situation, but it does seem to be that it is being processed effectively, at least. But of course, there's only so much you can do with a virus that it is spreading at that scale, and there have been outbreaks outside of China as well now.
Well, that's right. And all of the possible cases that have been tested in this country have proved negative, haven't they? But some suggestions that it has a fair chance of reaching these shores as well. Inside the Mail is a double-page spread focusing on the situation for some Britons. They're talking about some of the Britons who are in China, in the affected areas, and certainly Foreign Office advice tonight about avoiding any kind of travel to that area. So the question now is what happens to the ones who are there now?
That's right, and the government seemed to have made a bit of a U-turn just today in terms of initially they were saying we're not going to take anyone out of Wuhan, we're not going to withdraw any British citizens, and now that France and the US seem to be chartering flights to do just that, the government seems to be coming on board now too. And the Mail has spoken to a number of people, a number of Brits who are in that city, who are really desperate and hoping for help from the British government. And it does seem now that the British government will go in, take people out and bring them back to a quarantine situation in this country.
Well, yes, and Public Health England yesterday talked about the risk from the disease as being low. And there are still a lot of questions about it, aren't there? A huge number of cases, as you say, in the thousands, but 41 deaths, and obviously a tragedy, each of those deaths. But there needs to be a lot of questions answered before, worries should escalate too much, because obviously seasonal flu is also deadly in some cases as well. And at the moment, we don't know whether it'll mutate and become more dangerous. And there are a lot of questions about when it's infectious and how serious it could get at the moment.
That's right. I imagine it's something that's really, really difficult to calibrate, that the tenure of the information that's being given to the public, because you don't want people to be unduly worried, but at the same time, perhaps erring on the side of over-caution isn't a bad thing in this situation either. But you're right that there are questions around when is it actually infectious. It's said to have an incubation period of 7 days, so that's a bit of a worry because you won't be manifesting symptoms in that period when you might be infectious. But at the same time, has been a breakthrough in England in being able to test the virus and have the results within a day, which obviously is incredibly important when you're trying to put people under quarantine who need to be. And there is just round-the-clock race now to develop a vaccine internationally, which presumably is going to come into play quite soon. So yes, it is quite a tough one to calibrate, but yeah, in the UK, I don't think there is need to.
And certainly the message is the right preparations are being made in case it does come to this country. So we'll wait and see over the days ahead. Let's move on to another story that's on the front of the Sunday Times that you wanted to talk about. The headline there, Angry Trump casts cloud on Boris's big day. And this seems to focus over whether or not Huawei should get a contract in Britain's 5G network going ahead, and the dispute with America over that.
Right, with the decision being slated for coming out on Tuesday, Culture Secretary Nicky Morgan expected to make that announcement as to whether or not Huawei are going to go ahead with that building project. The pressure from the United States is reaching fever pitch from all different angles. The former presidential candidate, Marco Rubio, has been part of a big effort in trying to say, do not go for this company. Similarly, the president himself and the Treasury Secretary and the State Secretary as well have been all making these big moves, a sort of carrot and stick approach. On the one hand, saying, don't do this because, look, we can fast-track a huge, great free trade agreement between our two countries, and on the other hand, saying this is a very dangerous prospect and there could be damaging consequences if you go for it. But the government, I think, feels quite frustrated, as if they're in a bit of a bind, because ultimately they're looking for different people who can build 5G, and there are very few companies around the world that can do it on that scale.
A real tension here.
Definitely. It's a very early test, isn't it, for Boris Johnson? And it sounds like he's leaning into that. I mean, there was a point at which you thought that he was going to blow it off with a review that would kind of delay it for a bit more. But now it seems like a decision is imminent after all. And if he does stand up to Donald Trump on this, which it sounds as though he is going to do, then what does that mean in terms of, you know, does the US then get to make demands in other areas that would affect the trade relationship? But as far as I can tell, I can see no reason why Britain wouldn't make its own assessment about Huawei. There is the fact that the US warnings about it are laced with the US's own dynamic with China. It is part of their trade war with China as much as it is about anything else, and I see no reason why the UK should get dragged into that.
But also it's about those power blocks, and of course the UK is part of the Five Eyes community, that close security relationship between the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia and the UK. And if China is going to become a big player in terms of that sort of technological side of things, then that undermines that Western relationship.
OK, and let's quickly take in another story that's on the front of the Sunday Telegraph. The Observer also leads with a story about HS2. The Observer talks about the cost of cancelling it should Boris Johnson make the decision in the next couple of weeks not go ahead with one or both legs of the train line. The Sunday Telegraph has allegations about the costs involved and how they're being presented to us.
That's right. Yeah, the Sunday Telegraph has got the government-owned firm behind HS2. It's been accused of attempting to essentially con Boris Johnson by covering up costs and suggesting that they are lower than they actually are. This is coming from the former director of strategy at HS2, among other people. And of course, the government has denied all of these allegations. But it does sound as though, I mean, we already know that it's going to cost much more than was predicted. I think when it all began, it was priced at 30 billion, and now it's well over 100.
And there were some organisations that came out and saying this costing of 30 billion is nowhere near reality. And at the time, HS2 slammed those independent organisations, saying there's no way. I think the Institute of Economic Affairs said it would be 80 billion rather than 30, and now it's clearly going to be 100 billion. So really,
if not more.
It's quite an extraordinary
And I'm just going to give
ballooning of that.
HS2 Limited's response to some of the articles around. Their spokesman is saying, following the collapse of Carillion, HS2 Limited recognised the need to engage a healthy industry while continuing to protect value for money for the taxpayer, instead of artificially passing risk back and forth, as happened on other publicly funded projects. Contractors who do not meet the required performance will lose a proportion of their fee. This incentivises good performance and also prevents windfall profits from public money. And they talk about the executive team and board completely changing since some of the briefings and reports on costs. So that's their word on it. We do have to take a break right now. Plenty more to talk about, though, coming up. We've got lots to talk about. Also, something about Star Trek. That's what's coming up. This story. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, Rachel Shabi and Tom Harwood. And we're turning inside The Sun now, and an article about John Bercow and suggestions that he might be put forward for a peerage, and some resistance in some quarters to that.
Right, this is the extraordinary fallout of that leak from Jeremy Corbyn's nomination list that includes, unprecedentedly, the former Speaker John Bercow. And
unprecedentedly because he's a Tory rather than Labour, is that why
it's unprecedented because normally the Leader of the Opposition doesn't nominate the Speaker. The Speaker sort of almost automatically gets that sort of nomination, but obviously John Bercow was a very controversial figure in the chair, and now there's a dossier being compiled, including breached NDAs, testimony from former staff, talking about lots of allegations of John Bercow's bullying behaviour as Speaker, and there's been some quite extraordinary quotes come from very senior people and very junior people that are going to be put before the House of Commons Appointments Commission, and that's the body that could veto his peerage. So this dossier is part of an effort to stop him going to the Lords, and this is going to be something that that is a very live debate over the next weeks.
And I should say that John Bercow categorically denies any allegations of bullying. He said he's never bullied anyone anywhere at any time.
Right, but those allegations have been made and need to be looked into before such an appointment, you would think.
OK, and let's try and squeeze in another story about the BBC. This is inside the Mail on Sunday. Today wants professional northerner Robinson to host from Manchester, they're saying.
I mean, this just shows the sort of culture inside the BBC. They don't get it. The idea that they're going to be less London-centric by moving to another large metropolitan city, that's not going to help them understand the voters and the people in those left-behind parts of the country. They really need to stop thinking of the North as one conglomerate thing and understand that there are different communities, and this is just sort of a gimmick that I don't think is going to go down well with anyone. Do
you think that's right? Because the suggestion is that they would send one of the presenters for the Today programme up there. That's what they're suggesting here. Do you think that is a gimmick, or do you think it's an important symbol of saying that we're not just London-centric?
I think it's window dressing. You know, the BBC has got a problem, but it's more about the diversity of its staff. I'm not sure that necessarily that switching, you know, putting a studio in the north is going to fix that problem, because, you know, if your staff are still overwhelmingly, you know, from a particular section of society, then of course you're not going to represent the country as a whole.
OK, and finally, we did promise that we'd talk about Star Trek and Donald Trump.
We did.
Explain why this connection has been made.
Well, Donald Trump has had a sixth branch of the US military created called the Space Force. And, of course, a new branch of the military has to have a new logo. This is the logo, and a lot of people... It was unveiled yesterday, and the response was, isn't it similar to the Star Trek logo? And a lot of people were having a lot of fun online yesterday, making a lot of comparisons.
Well, exactly, and I can see there that Donald Trump there looking like he's on the Star Trek Enterprise.
He's been superimposed onto William Shatner's Captain Kirk, which I really wish I hadn't seen. You can't unsee that, can you?
OK, and on that note, we are out of time, but good to see you both, Rachel and Tom. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.